Hi, how's it going everyone? I'm Fed and I'm learning to make by watching tons and tons of YouTube videos across all kinds of maker topics. Today I'm doing a learning video where I put some of what I've learned into practice. And I'm going to be making an overhead Shop Vac Boom Arm.
Hi, I'm Fed. Ouch.
I have a small shop here. It's not very big at all. And I have this shop vac down here. Let's see if we can get you to see it. There, it's over there in the background. You see it back there? That shop vac is often, it's in the way, but the hose especially is in the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a boom arm that I'm going to mount to that wall back there. And it's going to hold the hose and it's going to go overhead, and I'll be able to move it around above me so that I can position the hose where I want it to be and it's not on the ground in my way as it is currently.
I start all my projects by doing just drawing. You know, I like to pretend that I'm Da Vinci. So I make these drawings, and then later on people will look at them and go, he was so smart. Look at him. Oh my gosh. Oh, look at that. I'm not very coordinated, so I slammed into the tripod with a piece of wood. Just coming up with a basic idea of like where the hose arm is going to go, and I'm using my super skills as a corner-to-corner line drawer to cut this piece of wood in half. The first cut I'm going to make here is just a rough cut around the center, but because it won't be exact, I will then set an actual width, and I'll use that width to cut both pieces of 1/2-inch plywood again so that they're exactly the same width. That's a way of maintaining accuracy so that all the pieces are the same.
So I was thinking I was going to cut this at 3 feet, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe at 2.5, so I could extend it out another, let's say, 2 feet with an extension, or 2.5 feet even.
I don't mean to brag, but yeah, I have a remote control shop vac button. Okay, I used my table saw sled to try to cut these pieces together, and I had to do it again because they weren't square. And I looked at the two pieces of wood and they weren't matching. I was like, why is that happening? And I was like, I wonder if the fence on my table saw is not square, and it's not. So then I fixed that, and then I cut those pieces again, and now they're square. So here we are. I'm just drawing some lines so I can use them as reference to redo that curve that I tried Da Vinciing earlier, which came out terrible. So I'm gonna mark some spots 5.5 inches from that corner, and then I'll use the lid for a bucket just to draw that curve. And now what I'm doing is I'm just marking where I'm going to put a rail, a straight edge, that I can use for my jigsaw. So the straight part I'll cut with the straight edge. And then I'll freehand the curve. And then I'll finish it off by using the straight edge again to cut the other end. Now I cut 2 of these, and on the second one I made a mistake. I went too fast and I cut into the line that I had drawn, so they didn't match. The rule with a jigsaw is nice and slow is the way to go. I got a new tool. This is a Wen disc and belt sander, and I've never used one before. I've seen a lot of people on YouTube do it, so I have no idea how it's going to work out.
what I've done is to fix that mistake I made by when I used the jigsaw is I clamped the two sides of my boom arm, and I'm going to sand these surfaces down so that they're flush.
Anyone that's ever used a sander like this knows that what I'm doing is just dumb. This is not how you do this. I'm not supporting the piece anywhere. I didn't learn this until afterwards, so note to self, learn how to use the tool before you use it. Now, here's another mistake. I'm trying to cut a 2x4. And I was like, oh, that piece didn't cut. I wonder why. Oh, it's because I didn't lower the blade to below the edge of the 2x4. So I did it again, and now it cut properly. What I'm doing here is I don't like the rounded edges on 2x4s, so I am using my table saw to make the 2x4 exactly 3 inches wide by cutting off the ends. And I'm just fitting it here to make sure it's good and it looks good. Now that little action there was to show you that even though I make mistakes and I don't always make cuts correctly, I do value my life and my limbs. And whenever you make any adjustments to a table saw, make sure it's unplugged. Really, really important. Safety first, kids. So now I'm just going to make sure I cut off just a little bit from the end of the 2x4. And here's proof that if you do something 1,000 times, eventually you'll get it right. So I wanted to cut some pieces of 1/2-inch plywood to go underneath the boom arm, and I wanted the bottom part of the boom arm to be a curved piece of plywood. But it's impossible to make plywood curve, I hear you incorrectly say to yourself through the internet. But you can. See, through the magic of kerf cuts, you can do that. David Picciuto from Make Anything has a couple of great videos on the technique, and now David does it very well, but I do it not nearly as good. What I'm doing here is tracing the straight piece of wood around the curved section that I want to cover, so I can mark the beginning and end of where I need to place my kerf cuts. The basic technique is to make a series of cuts that are just below the top layer of the plywood, leaving a little bit of uncut plywood. You put a little mark on the table saw sled or the table saw to help you space out those cuts so that they're nice and even. But even with that, I made a mistake, and you'll see that one of my kerf cuts was not properly spaced, but it curves. That's the important part. It's pretty cool, actually. See how cool that is? Now comes the glue 'em up stage. Gluing is fun. I really like to glue. I like gluing things. It's fun. Just making sure everything's square. Now entering clamp down. On your right, you'll see a clamp, and if you look out the left, you'll see a clamp. Since this is going to be connected to the main hinge portion, I just want to make sure it's nice and strong, so I'm putting in some countersunk holes and some screws. And here I'm just marking everything so that when I put it back on, I can line it up to the same spot, and I can trim off the end so it fits properly. Remember when I tried fixing my sloppy jigsaw cuts by using my belt sander? Well, I didn't do a great job. That's because I didn't support the piece on the sander. And you'll notice that later because there'll be all these gaps everywhere, which I try to fill in with sawdust and glue. This might just be me, but whenever I use a nail gun, I feel like a maker, even if I do a crappy job like I'm doing here. It's so much fun. I love nail guns. I watch Matthias Wandel do this all the time with glue and sawdust, but his always come out so much better. All right, there it is. It's pretty good. I mean, it's not great, but it works. So now I'm just fitting in the hose. It looks good. It looks, you know, it's functional. So now I'll put in the bottom piece, the final bottom piece there. Brad nails. Boom, boom. I love that. Oh, but what happened? I'm not very good at loading my brad nail gun, so it gets jammed sometimes. So I fixed that and now it's working. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the pieces for the inside extension arm. I kind of dry fit some things and like, okay, I'm going to use 1/4 inch MDF on the sides. I'm going to find the general center for this piece of MDF I'm going to use. I'm going to trim the pieces so that they're exactly the same height. Next, I needed to cut the bottom portion of the boom extension arm. I could have measured the two MDF sides to get the exact width of the bottom piece, but every once in a while I remember a useful technique from all those videos I watched through my eye holes, and that is this. Measuring and transferring measurements is an error-prone process, so when you can, use the actual materials you're working with instead of a tape measure. And here's what I mean. I knew that the space inside of the boom arm is 3 inches, and I set that on my table saw. This is the only measurement I used. Next, I stacked and clamped the 2 MDF pieces for the extension sides to my table saw fence. The remaining space between the sides and the table saw blade is the width of the bottom of the extension arm. So to capture that width, I placed a feather board on my table saw so that I was just touching the MDF pieces. I removed the clamps and MDF and then moved the fence until it just touched the feather board. And then I cut the bottom of the extension arm to the exact width I needed without measuring anything. So I'll admit, I felt really clever when I used this measurement technique, but that was short-lived because I put everything together and I glued it all up and it fit perfectly. But then later on, I discovered I had made some big mistakes, and you'll see what those are. The mistake that I made in building the extension arm hadn't quite dawned on me yet, so I started working on the hinge pieces that I was going to use to attach everything to the wall out of 1/2 inch plywood. Another great technique for maintaining accuracy in your measurements without using a tape measure is to use a stop block to keep everything exactly the same length. That's how I accomplished making these identical hinge pieces. I used my drill press to drill the holes for where the bolt was going to go through in the hinge pieces, and as I was finishing up, I realized that none of the holes had lined up because I don't have a fence or any way of lining up those holes on my drill press. I'm disregarding that issue for now, and I'm just deciding, okay, let's cut the 2x4 that's going to be the main mount for the hinge. I'm just making sure that everything lines up.
So I've made a bunch of mistakes. I was going to work around the mistakes as I went along. Like I cut things a little bit too short, a little too long, I sanded too much. And I think for the most part, those are all fixable. But I made some other mistakes. Primarily with this piece. This is the extension piece which sits inside of the main boom arm. I did 2 things wrong. First, I made it too short. I was trying to save material, which was silly, and I didn't think ahead to think, how am I going to mount this inside of the arm? The other thing is I cut all these hinge pieces. When I cut the holes with the bolts go through, I didn't use one as a template for all the other ones to get the hole in the same exact spot on each one. So now the holes are slightly off from each other on every single piece. So What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the best piece, which is this one, I think, use that as a template to drill the other holes. That will ensure that the holes in each one are exactly the same spot.
This whole thing could have been avoided if I had a fence and a way of aligning pieces on my drill press, but I don't. Someday I'll build something. Okay, so now I'm going to use my new Wen sander to sand out the corners so that they're nice and curved. This is really, really satisfying, by the way, using a sander. And hey, they all line up. I just use one of the hinge pieces as a spacer just to make sure that I cut the inner part of the hinge 2x4 to the correct length. Now it's glue them up time and screw them up time. No, just glue them up and then add screws. That's a better way of saying it. One of my favorite tools is this little tiny green square that I use to make sure that things are square. Now I'm cutting the new extension arm sides and bottom, but since you've already seen that, I'll just rush through this.
So I have this piece of leftover handle for one of those sponge paintbrushes. So I'm going to use this as the stopper, as the thing that will stop the extension arm from going too far. I'm going to cut a notch out like this, just going down.
A great tool to use to cut notches is a router. However, it helps to know how to use a router and how not to make mistakes, which I made a lot of here. I thought I had everything clamped down correctly so I could run the router to make this really clean hole, but I went a little bit too far in some parts. It's okay, but it's not the greatest. Now I glue everything together, but you can see that nice notch there on the side. Brad nail time! All right. See, that's a much better length for that extension arm. And now I'm just marking out on the main boom arm where these pieces of the handle are going to go to act as stops. See how carefully I'm marking where the pieces of the handles should go to act as stops? Well, I'm about to ruin that when I use a spade bit to put a hole into the sides where the stops go. Everything's great until boom, there. I blow out the back of the cut because I wasn't thinking. So now I have to try to clean it up, and it just looks terrible. You can see there's enormous gaps.
So the glue is dry on this hinge section. I'm going to drill some pilot holes and secure it with some 2.5-inch screws just to make sure that it's nice and secure.
I was so young then, so innocent. I thought I could do everything. I could never fail. So naive. And now I'm just kind of I'm dry fitting this just to make sure that the hinge works okay. All right, it's dry, so I can now add the screws in. I don't know if the screws are actually necessary, but it doesn't hurt, certainly.
This is what I did earlier in the project. I made these holes to hold these pieces of dowel in here so that when I slide the extension arm, it gets caught there in this section that I routed out. I did a really messy job of this. It looks terrible. I'm going to sand it down, make it look a little bit nicer, but you can see there's all these gaps and stuff. I would do this very differently if I did it again. For example, one thing I would do is I would have used a Forstner bit and I would have had a backer board on this side of it. I should have known this. Something I see in a lot of videos, but if you don't have a backer board, especially on something like plywood, when you go through, everything's fine until you go through the very last part of the wood and then everything gets blown out the back. These sanding blocks from Dura-Grit, I learned about them from Stumpy Nubs. They're really great. I love them. They don't wear out. You can just keep on sanding with them. Look at that. So this has been happening a lot because I didn't seal this with anything, but I've been inadvertently knocking out pieces of the kerf cuts that I made. This one's almost broken off. So I was wondering how I'm going to mount this, and I think I'm going to use a French cleat. It's something I see in a lot of maker videos, of woodworking videos, whole walls of French cleats, and I like the idea of being able to mount it like that way, so I'm gonna try that.
I'm going to fast forward through all this footage of the French cleat build I did because it turned out to be a giant mistake, and you can see the moment that I realize why it was a mistake. You might already know why this was a giant mistake. So there we go. I put in the French cleats and I'm like, oh wow, this is awesome. It's working. I got everything lined up. But then I'm like, what is happening? Why is this not staying? Oh, see, there it is. You can't use French cleats on something that is rocking back and forth because there's nothing to hold it in place. When the boom arm is not perfectly centered, it just falls off the cleats. So I took off the cleats and I decided to just mount the main hinge section directly to this cabinet that I have at the end of my garage. And that worked fine. That's how I should have done it from the start. Yay, and now I can fit it all in. It's looking pretty good. It's working. Hey, look at that. Look at that. The kid does a decent job in the end. I had these extra hooks for mounting things in your garage, so I decided to use one for a rockler hose that I have. The other I'm mounting to the side of the boom arm so I can hang up the hose when I'm not using it. Here I'm just testing out the little hose loop there, and it works great. I did